Why did Patton reject the M26 Pershing? You're probably already familiar with the American Sherman tank and its reputation in World War II. In popular memory, it's often reduced to a punchline. Outgunned, under-armored, and sent to fight enemies it could barely defeat head-on. The stories are real. The fear was real. By late 1944, American tank crews in Europe knew exactly what they were facing. German Panthers and Tigers dominated the battlefield at long range. Their thick frontal armor and powerful guns meant that every engagement felt like a gamble with terrible odds. Letters from the front reflected that fear. Tankers wrote home asking a simple, desperate question. Why are we still fighting in this thing? They had seen what happened when Shermans met German heavy tanks in open terrain. They had watched rounds bounce harmlessly off enemy armor while return fire tore through thin steel. For the men inside those tanks, the war was measured in seconds. Who saw whom first, whose gun penetrated, whose crew burned. And then there was the M26 Pershing. On paper, it looked like the solution everyone had been waiting for. Heavier armor, a powerful 90mm gun, a tank that could finally face Panthers and Tigers on something closer to equal terms. To many crews, the Pershing represented hope. Hope that the US Army had finally learned the lesson written in blood across the fields of Normandy, Lorraine, and the Ardennes. So the obvious assumption followed. Why wasn't it rushed into mass production sooner? And more pointedly, why did some senior commanders resist it? Here's where the story takes an uncomfortable turn. Because one of the men most often associated with that resistance was George S. Patton, America's most aggressive, most successful armored commander. The general whose Third Army raced across France. The man who believed speed could break armies. When discussions arose about slowing or halting Sherman production in favor of the Pershing, Patton appears to have expressed serious reservations. At first glance, that sounds almost unforgivable. How could a commander who demanded so much from his men hesitate to give them better protection? How could he look at the casualty lists and still argue for the continued use of a tank his crews feared? But that reaction misses something critical. Patton was not fighting the same war as the men inside his tanks. Tank crews fought the next engagement, the next crossroads, the next hedgerow, the next enemy silhouette emerging from the mist. Patton, on the other hand, was fighting the next campaign. He was fighting supply lines, operational tempo, and momentum. To him, the Sherman was not a dueling weapon. It was a tool of movement. Mechanized cavalry meant to exploit breakthroughs, bypass strong points, and collapse entire enemy systems before they could reorganize. This wasn't ignorance, and it wasn't callousness. It was strategy. To be absolutely clear from the start, this story is not about dismissing the legitimate fears of American tank crews, nor is it about declaring one tank right and the other wrong. Instead, it's about examining two fundamentally different philosophies of warfare, both valid, both costly, and both deeply human. One philosophy is written at eye level, from inside a steel hull under fire, where armor thickness and gun caliber decide whether you live or die in the next 5 minutes. The other is written on maps, where fuel consumption, repair depots, shipping capacity, and spare parts decide whether an army keeps moving, or stalls and bleeds. In this episode, we'll start with the tactical reality that American tank crews faced every day, the cold mathematics of armor and firepower that made every battle feel personal and terrifying. Then we'll step back and look at Patton himself, his background, his beliefs, and why he saw tanks not as armored fortresses, but as fast, expendable instruments of operational shock. Finally, we'll bring those perspectives together and see why both were true at the same time, and why commanders are often forced to make decisions that look cruel up close, but rational from far away. Because war isn't just about machines, it's about scale, and the distance between strategy and survival can be measured in lives. If you value slow, careful history that goes beyond myths and slogans, stories that respect both the men who fought and the leaders who made impossible choices, then you're in the right place. This is Beyond History. Follow us, like the episode, and subscribe for more deep dive stories where we don't rush to judge the past, but take the time to understand it. The tactical reality, what tank crews faced. First, we need to understand what American tankers confronted every single day in the autumn and winter of 1944, not in theory, not on paper, but in lived experience. The machine that came to dominate their fears was the German Panther tank. Among Allied crews, it quickly earned a reputation as something more than just another enemy vehicle. By most contemporary technical assessments, that reputation was grounded in reality. The Panther's frontal armor measured roughly 80 millimeters, and more importantly, it was sharply sloped. This combination dramatically increased its effective thickness. In practical terms, it meant that the standard 75mm gun, mounted on most American M4 Sherman tanks, struggled to penetrate the Panther's front at normal combat ranges. Test data and battlefield reports both suggested that frontal hits were often ineffective unless delivered at very close distance or under ideal conditions. At the same time, the Panther's long-barreled 75mm cannon, designed for high muzzle velocity and flat trajectory, gave German crews a lethal advantage. From ranges well beyond what most Sherman crews considered safe, Panther gunners could penetrate Sherman armor with relative ease. Even when exact distances varied by terrain, optics, and ammunition, the asymmetry was unmistakable. Now imagine the psychological weight of that imbalance. You could see the enemy tank, you could identify its position, you could know with grim clarity that firing at its front was unlikely to do anything meaningful, while knowing just as clearly that it could destroy you in return, often before you even realized you had been targeted. This wasn't a rare edge case. It was an experience repeated often enough to shape how crews thought, moved, and slept. During the summer fighting in Normandy, the landscape had offered some relief. The dense hedgerows compressed engagement ranges. Tanks met at distances measured in hundreds of yards, sometimes less. In those conditions, the Panther's long-range advantage mattered less, though its armor remained formidable. A Sherman crew might get lucky, catch a Panther at close range, slip around into thinner side armor, or work with infantry and tank destroyers to neutralize it. But by autumn, the war had changed shape. As Allied forces pushed eastward into more open terrain, engagement distances stretched. Fields widened, lines of sight lengthened. In these conditions, at 800, 1,000 yards, sometimes more, the Panther was operating in its ideal environment. The Sherman was not. The Sherman weighed roughly 33 tons, significantly lighter than the Panther, and its armor was largely vertical rather than sloped. That made it faster, easier to transport, and simpler to maintain, but it also meant less protection when hit. Over time, the tank acquired a grim nickname among some crews, the Ronson Lighter, implying it lit every time. Here, it's important to be precise. Post-war historians, most notably Stephen Zaloga, examined wartime records and found that this reputation was statistically exaggerated. When Shermans were penetrated, they did not ignite more often than comparable tanks on a per-penetration basis. Ammunition stowage improvements and wet stowage designs reduced fire risk significantly by late 1944. But statistics rarely comfort men under fire. What mattered to crews was not the probability of fire after penetration. It was the fact that the Sherman was penetrated more often in the first place. More penetrations meant more chances for fire, more crew casualties, more burned-out hulls dotting the landscape. Even if the math said one thing, memory said another. The sight of a familiar silhouette burning in a field, black smoke rolling skyward, hatches open or torn away. Letters home and diary entries reflect this anxiety. While no single account can be verified down to the last detail, the the pattern is consistent across many sources. Tankers wrote about rounds bouncing off enemy armor, about seeing a nearby Sherman destroyed by a single hit, about the helplessness of firing again and again with no visible effect. After-action reports from company and battalion commanders echoed these themes, even if they framed them in more restrained language. It would be a mistake to claim that all crews felt this fear equally, or that every engagement followed the same script. Post-war memoirs sometimes amplified the sense of universal dread. But there is little doubt that the psychological burden was real enough to influence tactics and morale. Crews learned, through bitter experience, that survival often depended on numbers and maneuver. The emerging tactical logic was brutally simple. Fix the Panthers' attention from the front, maneuver other tanks to the flanks, accept that losses might occur before a killing shot could be delivered. At the operational level, this approach worked. German units were worn down, bypassed, or destroyed. At the individual level, it felt merciless. Against this backdrop, the appeal of a heavier American tank was obvious. The M26 Pershing appeared to promise a different equation. Roughly 46 tons, a powerful 90mm gun, and armor designed to withstand the kind of hits that Sherman's could not. Reports suggested it could engage Panthers frontally under the right conditions. For crews who had fought through Lorraine and the Ardennes, the Pershing looked less like a new vehicle and more like overdue acknowledgement. That desperation showed itself in the field. Some crews welded extra steel plates or mounted sandbags on their hulls, modifications documented in unit maintenance records. These measures added weight, strained suspensions, and offered questionable real protection. But they provided something else: psychological reassurance. Others altered markings or improvised camouflage, hoping to confuse German gunners. Such changes were rarely ordered from above. They came from below, from men trying to tilt the odds however they could. Tank commanders adapted too. Many adopted a rule of constant movement in open terrain, believing that a moving tank was harder to hit than a stationary one. Others refused to advance without close infantry support, fully aware that German anti-tank guns were as deadly as Panthers. Each adaptation imposed constraints, each slowed operations, each added mental strain. Sherman crews, in effect, were fighting two battles at once, one against the enemy and one against the limitations of their own machine. So when rumors spread in late 1944 that a new American heavy tank was coming, it's easy to understand the reaction. For many crews, the Pershing symbolized more than improved armor or firepower. It felt like recognition, proof that what they had been enduring was seen, acknowledged, and finally being addressed. And that is why the question matters. If the need seemed so obvious at the front, why did senior commanders, especially Patton, hesitate? To answer that, we have to step away from the turret and into the map room. Patton's cavalry mind, a different vision of war. Now that we understand the tactical reality confronting Sherman crews at the front, the fear, the noise, the claustrophobia, and the lethal arithmetic of armor and gun caliber, we need to step back even further, away from the turret and into the map room. There, the battlefield looked very different. There, decisions were made not in seconds, but in hours and days. And at that level, one man's mental world mattered enormously: George S. Patton. Patton's way of thinking was shaped far less by tank-on-tank combat than by a much older military tradition: mounted cavalry. His professional instincts were formed long before tanks dominated battlefields. As a young officer, he served in the U.S. cavalry, riding horses, studying pursuit, shock, and the psychology of collapse. By nearly every account, he never truly abandoned that mental framework. The horse was eventually replaced by the internal combustion engine, but the underlying ideas, speed, aggression, and relentless pressure, remained intact. To Patton, war was not primarily about trading blows head-on until one side collapsed from sheer attrition. That kind of fighting, in his view, was slow, unimaginative, and wasteful of opportunity. War, as he understood it, was about movement, momentum, and the ruthless exploitation of weakness. It was about getting inside the enemy's decision cycle, striking so fast and so unpredictably that the enemy never had time to think clearly, reorganize, or recover. Confusion, not annihilation, was often the decisive weapon. Where many officers later came to see tanks as armored fortresses, mobile gun platforms designed to stand and fight, Patton appears to have seen them as mechanized horses. They were not meant to absorb punishment. They were meant to impose it psychologically and organizationally. Their true value lay not in how thick their armor was, but in how deeply they could penetrate, how quickly they could move, and how badly they could disrupt the enemy's system once they were loose in the rear. One of Patton's formative experiences came not in Europe, but in Mexico, during the 1916 to 1917 expedition against Pancho Villa. The U.S. Army was chasing a mobile, elusive enemy across vast distances with poor roads and limited infrastructure. Patton participated in some of the Army's earliest motorized operations there, using automobiles in roles that foreshadowed later mechanized warfare. The historical record of this episode is uneven, and later retellings, some encouraged by Patton himself, occasionally exaggerate his role. But the lesson he seems to have taken from it is consistent and revealing. Relentless pursuit mattered more than perfect firepower. An enemy forced to keep moving, never allowed to pause, regroup, or establish a coherent defense, could be broken psychologically and organizationally, even if not annihilated in a single decisive battle. Constant pressure frayed command structures. Fatigue replaced cohesion. Orders became confused or irrelevant. Retreat became habit. And once retreat became habitual, collapse often followed. To Patton, this was not theory. It was a pattern he believed repeated itself across history. That idea stayed with him through the interwar years, when armies around the world struggled to define what tanks were actually for. In the United States, many officers viewed tanks primarily as tools to support infantry, slowly battering their way through prepared defenses in carefully planned, methodical operations. Patton argued for something fundamentally different. In his conception, tanks were not meant to fight the enemy's strongest points. They were meant to avoid them. Infantry and artillery would do the brutal, grinding work of opening the door. Once a gap appeared, armor should surge through it without hesitation. He watched foreign developments closely, especially the German campaigns in Poland and France in 1939 to 1940. The evidence suggests that Patton was less impressed by the individual technical qualities of German tanks than by how they were used. German armored formations did not stop to win every engagement. They bypassed resistance, cut communications, severed supply networks, and forced enemy armies into cascading retreats. Tactical victories mattered far less than the systemic disintegration those maneuvers produced. The enemy did not just lose battles, it lost the ability to function as an army. By the time Patton took command of United States Third Army in 1944, this way of thinking had hardened into a clear operational vision. He expressed it in characteristically blunt language. Hold them by the nose and kick them in the pants. This was not merely colorful rhetoric designed for morale or headlines. It reflected a consistent operational pattern visible in his orders, movements, and priorities across France and into Germany. The concept was simple in theory and brutal in execution. Infantry and artillery would engage the enemy frontally, fixing them in place, denying them freedom of maneuver, and forcing them to focus forward. Meanwhile, armored formations would sweep around the flanks and pour into rear areas where resistance was thinner and the consequences far greater. Once in the rear, Patton expected disorder to multiply on its own. Supply lines could be cut, leaving front-line units without fuel, ammunition, or food. Headquarters could be overrun, shattering command and control. Road junctions could be seized, trapping formations that suddenly discovered they had nowhere to retreat. In Patton's vision, the enemy did not need to be destroyed piece by piece. It needed to be unbalanced, confused, and pushed past the point where recovery was possible. This was the war Patton wanted to fight, not a slow contest of armor thickness and gun caliber, but a campaign of dislocation, shock, and collapse. Seen through that lens, his priorities begin to look very different from those of the men inside the tanks. For Patton, the ideal tank was not necessarily the one that won every duel, it was the one that kept moving. A tank that broke down deep in enemy territory was not merely ineffective. It was dangerous. It clogged roads, delayed columns, and disrupted the flow of operations. A tank that required halting production lines or restructuring supply chains threatened something Patton valued above almost everything else: continuity of operations. Any pause, even for sound technical reasons, gave the enemy time to recover, dig in, and restore coherence. Weight mattered deeply in this calculus. He understood that heavier tanks strained bridges, roads, and recovery assets. A tank that could not cross existing bridges without engineer support imposed delays. Delays meant lost momentum. Lost momentum meant missed opportunities, those fleeting moments when enemy formations were vulnerable, disorganized, and close to collapse. In Patton's apparent thinking, time was often more valuable than protection. Speed could achieve effects that firepower never could. A tank arriving 2 days earlier, even if less well armored, might seize a critical crossing, cut a supply route, or trap an enemy cause in retreat. A better protected tank arriving 2 days later might find the opportunity gone, the enemy reformed, and the battle reset at a higher cost. This was the operational logic that shaped Patton's assessment of tanks like the Sherman and the Pershing. He was not blind to their differences. He understood armor thickness, gun performance, and survivability. But he evaluated those factors through the lens of campaign warfare, not individual survival. His responsibility was not to a single crew or a single engagement, but to the movement of entire armies across hundreds of miles. That perspective does not erase the fear felt by crews. It does not make their losses abstract or acceptable, but it does explain why a commander responsible for entire armies could look at the same battlefield and reach a very different conclusion. Understanding that gap, the view from inside the turret versus the view from the map room, is essential to understanding not just why Patton thought the way he did, but why modern war so often forces leaders into choices where every option carries real, human, and painful cost. Sherman's 3 strategic virtues. Patton's preference for the Sherman does not appear to have been born of ignorance or indifference. The surviving record suggests almost the opposite. George S. Patton received complaints from tank crews, read after-action reports, and was well aware of casualty figures. He knew the names of units that had been mauled, the routes littered with burned-out vehicles, and the grim arithmetic faced by men inside thin steel hulls. He understood what his soldiers were up against, but when he weighed those realities, he seems to have placed greater value on 3 strategic qualities that, in his judgment, outweighed the Sherman's tactical disadvantages. These were not abstract ideas. They were hard, practical considerations shaped by campaign warfare, by the problem of keeping entire armies moving, supplied, and fighting across hundreds of miles. Reliability, the workhorse philosophy. The first of these qualities was reliability. The M4 Sherman, especially later variants such as the M4A3 with its Ford GAAV8 engine, earned a reputation as a dependable machine. It was not elegant, it did not push the boundaries of armor design, but it started, ran, and kept running. Its drivetrain was well understood, its engine comparatively robust, and its maintenance procedures standardized across the U.S. Army. Mechanics from Normandy's hedgerows to the outskirts of the German frontier knew how to keep it alive. The supply system could deliver spare parts forward with relative efficiency. When something broke, it was usually fixable, and fixable quickly. This stood in sharp contrast to many German tanks American forces encountered. The Panther tank, formidable on the battlefield, was notoriously demanding mechanically. German designers had prioritized performance and firepower, often at the expense of durability. Its final drive was a known weak point, and wartime German records confirmed that many Panthers were lost to breakdowns rather than enemy fire. The tank could dominate a firefight when everything worked, but everything did not always work. Patton appears to have understood a harsh but simple reality. A tank immobilized by mechanical failure is no longer an offensive weapon. A Panther or Tiger eye with a broken transmission becomes a fixed position, useful only for local defense. It cannot exploit a breakthrough. It cannot pursue a retreating enemy. It cannot seize distant objectives. A Sherman that remained operational, even if technically inferior, could still move forward and apply pressure. In the kind of war Patton wanted to fight, movement itself was a weapon. The tank that kept running mattered more than the tank that won every theoretical duel on a firing range. Speed and mobility. Operational tempo. The second virtue Patton valued was speed and mobility, not in isolation, but as part of a larger concept, operational tempo. On good roads, the Sherman could sustain speeds in the range of 25 to 30 miles per hour. In the context of war-damaged European infrastructure in 1944, this was more than sufficient. It allowed armored units to reach objectives faster than German planners expected, to seize river crossings before demolition charges could be set, and to appear in rear areas before defenses had time to harden. During the August 1944 advance after the Normandy breakout, United States Third Army advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. German formations repeatedly failed to establish coherent defensive lines, not because they were always destroyed in direct combat, but because American units arrived sooner than anticipated. Command posts were overrun while still setting up. Supply depots were captured before evacuation. Orders arrived too late to matter. That relentless pace, rather than any single decisive battle, appears to have been decisive in collapsing German resistance across much of France. Weight played a crucial role in this mobility. At roughly 33 tons, the Sherman could cross most European bridges without special preparation. Engineers were not routinely required to build heavy pontoon bridges or reinforce existing structures. Columns did not have to halt and wait. Units could keep flowing forward. Every hour saved at a river crossing was an hour denied to the enemy, an hour they could not use to regroup, resupply, or reorganize resistance. From Patton's perspective, delays were dangerous. Momentum, once lost, was difficult to regain. The Sherman's mobility helped preserve that momentum, and momentum was the currency Patton spent most freely. Numbers. Strategic mass. The third virtue, and perhaps the most decisive in Patton's calculus, was numbers. American industry produced nearly 50,000 Shermans by the end of the war. By late 1944, production lines were mature, output was high, and the logistical system was optimized around a single vehicle. Ships carried Shermans across the Atlantic in enormous quantities. Replacement tanks, spare parts, and trained crews flowed steadily towards the front. Patton appears to have grasped a brutal truth about sustained operations. Losses were inevitable, and they had to be replaced immediately. If a unit lost 10 tanks in a week, those 10 had to be replaced, not eventually, but now. The Sherman made that possible. Crews trained on it. Mechanics understood it. The supply chain revolved around it. Introducing the M26 Pershing on a large scale would have required retooling production lines and restructuring logistics. Even a temporary drop in output during that transition would have meant fewer tanks reaching the front, at the very moment Patton was demanding more vehicles to sustain his offensives. From his standpoint, deliberately slowing tank production in the middle of active campaigning would have been strategically dangerous. This was not a simplistic dismissal of quality. Patton appears to have defined quality differently. To him, quality meant reliability, availability, and continuity. A tank that was good enough and present in large numbers could be more valuable than a superior tank that was scarce, mechanically fragile, or slow to arrive. We cannot verify every quote Patton may or may not have used in conversations with ordnance officials, but his documented actions, his operational priorities, and the patterns visible in his campaigns all point in the same direction. He favored maintaining the flow of vehicles to the front over introducing a new model that would disrupt an established system in mid-stride. In Patton's calculus, war at the campaign level was not won by the best individual machine. It was won by pressure applied everywhere, all the time, by forces that kept moving when the enemy could not, and that refused to give the opponent the one thing they needed most: time. Pershing's strategic challenges. Meanwhile, the M26 Pershing, so impressive on paper and so eagerly anticipated by tank crews, appears to have raised serious concerns for George S. Patton when viewed from the level at which he fought wars, the campaign. There is little doubt that the Pershing represented a genuine leap forward in battlefield survivability. Its 90mm gun could engage German heavy tanks on far more equal terms, and its thicker, sloped armor could absorb hits that would punch cleanly through a Sherman. For the men inside the turret, this was not an abstract improvement. It was the difference between life and death in the next encounter. From a crewman's perspective, the Pershing was plainly a better tool, but for a commander responsible for keeping an entire army moving across a shattered continent, those advantages came with costs that multiplied as soon as one stepped back from the individual tank and looked at roads, bridges, fuel dumps, repair depots, and the relentless clock of operational tempo. Weight, the hidden burden. The most immediate issue was weight. At roughly 46 tons, the Pershing was about 13 tons heavier than the M4 Sherman. On paper, that difference may seem modest. In practice, it rippled outward through the entire logistical and engineering system. Heavier tanks placed greater strain on transporters, increasing fuel consumption and mechanical wear. Roads that tolerated continuous Sherman traffic could degrade faster under heavier vehicles, turning supply routes into bottlenecks of mud, dust, and broken pavement. But the most critical constraint involved bridges. For Patton, rivers were not just terrain features. They were decisive moments. Cross them quickly, and they became protective barriers shielding deep advances. Fail to cross in time, and they became choke points where momentum died and the enemy recovered. The Sherman's relatively light weight allowed it to cross most European bridges without special preparation. Columns could surge forward, often catching German forces before demolitions were complete. The Pershing did not enjoy that same freedom. Heavy tanks frequently required reinforced crossings or specialized bridging equipment. That meant engineers. Engineers meant waiting, and waiting meant time. In Patton's worldview, time was the enemy's ally. Every hour spent stalled on a riverbank was an hour the Germans could use to reorganize, shift reserves, or solidify defenses. We cannot document a specific conversation in which Patton rejected the Pershing explicitly on engineering grounds, but his operational orders consistently emphasized speed, continuity, and avoidance of delay. Anything that forced an army to pause, especially at rivers, ran directly counter to the way he fought. Logistics, fuel, and reach. Fuel presented a second problem, and it was one Patton understood painfully well. In September 1944, the rapid advance of United States Third Army stalled outside Metz, not solely because of German resistance, but because supply lines stretching back to the Normandy beaches could not keep up. Patton had outrun his logistics. Tanks, trucks, and half-tracks sat idle, not for lack of courage, but for lack of gasoline. Patton raged against fuel shortages because he understood a brutal truth. Speed meant nothing if vehicles ran dry. A heavier tank inevitably consumes more fuel per mile. But the issue went deeper than simple consumption. More fuel per tank meant more trucks devoted to hauling gasoline. More fuel trucks meant fewer vehicles available to carry ammunition, food, spare parts, and infantry support. Logistics, at the margins, is a zero-sum system. Resources allocated to one demand are resources denied to another. Staff officers almost certainly ran comparative estimates on fuel requirements for different tank types, even if the precise figures have not survived. What does not require documentation is physics. Moving heavier machines over long distances costs more energy. For a commander already fighting constant supply battles, that increase would have mattered, and it would have compounded with every mile advanced. Mechanical uncertainty, the risk of the new. Finally, there was mechanical reliability, and this may have been the most troubling issue of all. By late 1944, the Sherman was a known quantity. It had been fighting since North Africa in 1942. It had been refined through Sicily and Italy, blooded in Normandy, and driven across France. Its weaknesses were well understood. Its failure modes were familiar. Mechanics knew what broke, how often, and how to fix it. Disabled Shermans could often be recovered, repaired, and returned to service without long interruptions. The Pershing, by contrast, was new. It introduced new systems throughout: engine, transmission, drivetrain, and early evaluations suggested that its power-to-weight ratio was less forgiving than that of the Sherman. While it could perform well, the margin was tight. Sustained operations had a way of exposing stresses that short trials never revealed. Like most new combat vehicles, it was vulnerable to teething problems, the kind that only appeared after weeks of hard use on poor roads under combat conditions. From Patton's perspective, this uncertainty carried real operational risk. His style relied on armored spearheads pushing far ahead of support units. A breakdown under those conditions was more than an inconvenience. A Pershing immobilized on a narrow road, waiting for specialized parts not yet widely stocked, serviced by mechanics still learning unfamiliar systems, could halt an entire column. Momentum would drain away, not because of enemy action, but because of machinery. The available evidence suggests Patton wanted to avoid precisely that scenario. He appears to have preferred tanks that were predictably imperfect over tanks that were theoretically superior, but operationally uncertain. A Sherman that ran reliably, even if vulnerable, fit his method of war better than a Pershing that fought superbly when everything worked, but risked extended downtime when it did not. This does not mean Patton believed the Pershing was a bad tank. It means he judged it unsuited, at that specific moment, in that specific logistical environment, to the kind of fast-moving, relentless campaigning he believed would end the war sooner. And here, the tension becomes unavoidable. What tank crews needed most was survivability in the next fight. What Patton needed most was momentum in the next 100 miles. Both needs were real. Both were rational. And in the unforgiving arithmetic of modern war, neither could be fully satisfied at the same time. Two different wars, understanding both perspectives. At this point, we can see why both perspectives carried real weight. American tank crews and George S. Patton were not locked in an argument because one side was blind, uncaring, or wrong. They were grappling with different problems at different levels of war, and those levels almost never align cleanly. What looked like a life-or-death flaw from inside a turret could look like an acceptable risk from the map room. What looked like caution, even timidity, at the campaign level could feel like abandonment at the tactical one. This was not a failure of empathy or intelligence. It was the unavoidable friction between scales of command. The tactical perspective. Survival in the next 1,000 yards. For an individual tank crew, war was immediate, compressed, and intensely personal. Their world extended only a few hundred yards ahead, perhaps 1,000 in open terrain. Beyond that, the map blurred into irrelevance. Their mission, however simply worded, was brutal in reality. Survive the next engagement. At that scale, the logic was stark and unmistakable. The M26 Pershing was objectively superior. Thicker armor meant better odds of surviving a hit. A 90mm gun meant the ability to engage a Panther tank frontally at range, instead of gambling on flank shots or closing to distances where a single enemy round could be fatal. Imagine a Sherman crew in Lorraine in November 1944. Their M4 Sherman is hull down behind a low rise, the ground frozen hard beneath the tracks. The commander scans through his optics and catches movement, a Panther, dark against a grey winter sky. He calls it out. The gunner tracks the silhouette. The range is estimated at 900 yards. They all know the math. At that distance, their 75mm gun is unlikely to penetrate the Panther's frontal armor. If the Panther sees them first, one accurate shot could punch straight through their hull. So they hesitate. They wait. They radio for another tank to maneuver. They hope for a flank shot. Or they back away entirely, even though retreat feels like failure. And in the back of every mind inside that steel box is the same unspoken thought. If we had a Pershing, we could take that shot now. Who could reasonably fault them for wanting that? Wanting a tank that let them fight instead of wait? Wanting a machine that gave them agency instead of forcing caution? That desire was not cowardice. It was not complaining. It was a rational response to lethal asymmetry, an attempt to restore balance in a fight where the odds felt stacked against them. For crews, the issue was not theory. It was survival measured in seconds. The difference between armor that held and armor that failed was the difference between concussion and incineration. In that context, the desire for the Pershing was not just understandable, it was inevitable. The operational perspective, winning the campaign, not the duel. Patton's perspective was fundamentally different. His view stretched across entire maps of Western Europe, from the Normandy beaches across France toward the Rhine. His responsibility was not the next firefight, but the next phase of the war. His mission was not to win individual tank duels. It was to keep entire enemy formations retreating so fast they never had time to reorganize. After the Normandy breakout, United States Third Army advanced at a pace that shocked both allies and enemies. German divisions attempting to fall back discovered American units already ahead of them, cutting roads and blocking crossings. Supply depots were captured intact. Headquarters were overrun so quickly that staff officers were sometimes taken prisoner before they understood what had happened. This was the kind of war Patton wanted to fight, not because it was gentle, but because it was decisive. The August 1944 race across France offers the clearest example. Third Army advanced more than 400 miles in less than a month. That advance was not achieved by destroying every German strongpoint. Quite the opposite. Patton's forces often bypassed resistance entirely. Strongpoints were isolated, cut off from fuel and ammunition, rendered irrelevant without a tank battle ever taking place. At times, Third Army units advanced 50 or 60 miles in a single day. At that tempo, reliability mattered more than raw combat power. A tank that broke down in the morning might never rejoin its unit. Recovery vehicles lagged far behind. Repair depots were constantly relocating. In that environment, the Sherman's mechanical simplicity was not a convenience, it was a necessity. Mechanics could often get a disabled Sherman running again with basic tools and common parts. More complex vehicles, requiring unfamiliar components or specialized expertise, risked being abandoned along the roadside, and abandoned tanks were worse than destroyed ones. They clogged narrow roads, delayed columns, and drained momentum. As the tempo increased, traditional set-piece tank battles became rarer. German forces seldom had the time to prepare defensive lines with Panthers and Tigers properly positioned. When they tried, American units were often already slipping past them, threatening encirclement and forcing yet another retreat. The war Patton was fighting was not about trading shots with enemy tanks. It was about making those shots unnecessary through maneuver. Speed was not merely an advantage, it was foundational. When columns stopped for fuel, Germans regrouped. When columns stopped for bridge construction, Germans escaped. When columns stopped for repairs, Germans stabilized fronts. From Patton's operational standpoint, introducing the Pershing risked slowing that tempo. Even if Pershings won more individual engagements, and they likely would have, the question he seems to have asked was broader and colder. Would the campaign as a whole move faster or slower? His answer, shaped by experience, appears to have been slower. Two valid truths at two levels of war. The evidence suggests that American tank crews and Patton were not truly at odds in principle. They were responding to legitimate needs at different levels of warfare, needs that rarely align and often pull in opposite directions. For the individual soldier, the logic is immediate and unavoidable. Survival is not an abstraction. It is the difference between going home and not going home. Wanting thicker armor, a stronger gun, and better odds in a face-to-face encounter is not selfishness. It is human. More than that, it is militarily rational. Armies that ignore the physical and psychological survival of their soldiers eventually lose cohesion, morale, and effectiveness. Fear corrodes discipline. Distrust undermines obedience. From inside a tank, the world shrinks. Decisions are measured in seconds. In that context, the desire for the Pershing was entirely reasonable. It promised not just better performance, but dignity, a sense that the institution valued the lives of the men inside the machine. Commanders, however, are judged by a different standard. They are not evaluated by individual firefights, but by campaigns. Their responsibility extends beyond the next engagement to the next 100 miles, the next river line, the next month of fighting. They must weigh lives against time, protection against momentum, and tactical advantage against the risk of operational paralysis. These are not philosophical exercises. They are grim calculations imposed by the scale of war itself, and sometimes those calculations point in opposite directions. This tension is not unique to tanks. It appears again and again throughout military history. Should infantry carry heavier body armor and move slower, or lighter loads and move faster? Should aircraft be armored to survive hits, or stripped down to avoid being hit at all? Should artillery be more powerful but less mobile, or more mobile but less destructive? There are no perfect answers, because war rarely rewards perfection at every level simultaneously. In the case of the Sherman and the Pershing, history delivered a nuanced verdict. The Pershing did arrive in Europe in early 1945, in limited numbers. By most accounts, it performed well. Crews valued its armor and firepower. When it fought Panthers, it gave American tankers something they had often lacked: the ability to engage confidently rather than cautiously. But it arrived too late, and in too small a quantity, to alter the course of the war. That war had already been shaped, largely with Shermans. Germany was defeated not primarily through winning tank-for-tank duels, but by being outmaneuvered, outpaced, and denied the time needed to recover. Allied forces penetrated rear areas, severed supply lines, captured fuel dumps, seized road networks, and forced German formations into retreat after retreat until resistance collapsed. That outcome owed less to individual equipment superiority than to sustained operational pressure. This does not mean the Sherman was better than the Pershing in a technical sense. It means that, for much of the war, it fit the kind of war the Allies, especially commanders like Patton, were determined to fight. It was not designed to dominate frontal duels. It was designed to be present everywhere, to keep moving, and to apply pressure relentlessly. In that kind of war, Patton believed, rightly or wrongly, that the Sherman was the right instrument, not because it spared lives in the short term, but because he believed it shortened the war itself. And in the cruel arithmetic of command, shortening the war was the greatest act of mercy a general could offer. The tragedy, and the truth, is that both perspectives were valid. The crew's need to survive the next battle, and the commander's need to win the next campaign. History does not allow us to choose one without acknowledging the cost of the other. Legacy and lessons. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, events themselves had largely answered the Sherman versus Pershing question, if not in doctrine, then in outcome. The M26 Pershing did see combat. In the engagements where it appeared, it proved capable, resilient, and respected by its crews. Its 90mm gun and heavier armor demonstrated that American industry could, when pressed, field a tank that met German heavy armor on more equal terms. For the men inside the turret, the Pershing delivered something invaluable: confidence. But it arrived late. It arrived in limited numbers, and it never displaced the M4 Sherman as the backbone of American armored forces before VE Day. The war had already been fought, and largely won, with Shermans. The campaigns most closely associated with George S. Patton, the explosive breakout and dash across France, the rapid pivot north to relieve Bastogne during the Ardennes crisis, and the relentless drive into Germany in early 1945, were all conducted with a force structure centered on the Sherman. Those campaigns succeeded despite the tank's undeniable tactical disadvantages against Panthers and Tigers. In the specific conditions of late-war Western Europe, operational tempo proved more decisive than individual tank superiority. That does not mean Patton was right about everything. Military history is crowded with commanders who clung too tightly to familiar ideas, who privileged abstract operational theories over the lived danger faced by the men executing them. The tank crews who wanted better armor and a more powerful gun were not mistaken. Their complaints were not emotional exaggerations. They were grounded in daily experience. Every engagement carried mortal risk. Every burning tank meant friends lost. If better equipment could have reduced even a fraction of those losses, that mattered. Every life mattered. But what Patton appears to have understood, something often lost when debates narrow to armor thickness and gun caliber, is that wars are not won by tallying successful duels. They are won by campaigns, sustained operations that erode an enemy's ability and will to resist. A general's burden is not the next firefight. It is the next month, the next riverline, the next collapse of enemy cohesion. Sometimes that burden forces decisions that look wrong at the tactical level, but appear necessary at the operational one. Sometimes it means accepting higher short-term risk in the belief that momentum will shorten the war itself. The controversy over the Sherman and the Pershing reveals something fundamental and uncomfortable about military decision-making. The best weapon for an individual soldier is not always the best weapon for winning the war. Strategic virtues like reliability, mobility, and availability can, under certain circumstances, outweigh tactical shortcomings like inferior armor and firepower. Commanders are forced to choose not for comfort, not even always for immediate survival, but for campaign success and ultimate strategic objectives. In Patton's case, that choice meant sticking with the Sherman despite its limitations. To the men inside those tanks, that decision often felt cruel. They cursed the thin armor. They feared the Panthers. They learned to fight cautiously, creatively, desperately. Their perspective deserves respect, remembrance, and honesty. They paid the price of operational decisions with fear, grief, exhaustion, and sometimes with their lives. But understanding Patton's choice, understanding the scale of warfare he believed he was fighting, helps explain why capable commanders sometimes make decisions that carry painful costs. War is tragic not only because people die, but because even choices made in pursuit of victory and mercy inevitably demand sacrifice. The Pershing was a capable tank, the Sherman was a flawed but reliable one, and Patton was a commander who, based on the evidence we have, chose the machine that fit his vision of how wars were actually won, not tank by tank, but army by army. Whether he was right or wrong ultimately depends on which scale of warfare you believe mattered more, the tactical struggle between individual crews and enemy tanks, or the operational struggle between entire armies racing toward collapse or survival. Both were real. Both were costly. And the tension between them is part of what makes military history not just fascinating, but profoundly sobering. If this exploration of World War II decision-making stayed with you, if it made you think not just about machines, but about the human choices behind them, then we invite you to continue the journey with Beyond History. Subscribe for more deep-dive stories that go beyond simple answers. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. And tell us in the comments, did Patton make the right choice? Or should the Pershing have come sooner? There are no easy answers, but asking the question matters.